Podcasting from Portland East to Portland West, from Big Pine Key to Pacific Beach, and from San Juan to Guam, this is All Across America. So Matt McCaw is the executive director of Greater Idaho, a movement for the Oregon counties east of the Cascade Mountains to secede from the state of Oregon and join Idaho. Matt, it's great to have you on the show. Welcome to All Across America.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mark.
So I think a lot of this has to do with geography. Maybe we could start if you could give us a geography lesson on the state of Oregon.
Yeah, you're right. So much of it does have to do with geography because the state of Oregon is really two very different places. We are divided by the Cascade Mountain Range. So Washington is similar, but the Cascade Mountain Range kind of runs right up the center of our state. And on the west side of the mountains, you have at low elevation, very wet climate, very fertile soil, heavy population. So the west side of our state is very urban, moderate temperatures. You get out here on the east side of the state, and we're much more like the high desert kind of, mountain climate. We have a high elevation, very little rain, poor soil. It's a completely different geography, cold winters, hot summers. And what that does is it creates different people that make their livings different way, have different cultures. And it has always been this way in Oregon, that the east side of the state was very different than the west side of the state. And so that geography has created this divide, and that now has a cultural component where the people on the east side of the state are very different culturally and politically than the people on the west side of the state. And that causes problems because the people on the east side of the state are very conservative and very like-minded and very conservative and very similar to the people next door to us in Idaho. But the people on the west side of Oregon are very left-leaning, very progressive. And there's, about 90% of the population lives on the west side of the state and only 10% on the east side of the state. So whatever the west side of the state wants politically, they get. They have supermajorities in the legislature, any kind of statewide ballot measure they can pass. And so what happens is you get policy forced on people that live hundreds of miles away in a completely different geography and climate with a completely different culture and political views. And you get policy forced on those people that don't make sense for us, that we don't want, we don't vote for, and that causes tension, a lot of tension. And that's been the case. I grew up in Oregon. I've lived here all but 2 years of my life. I've lived on the west side of the state. I've lived on the east side of the state. I've lived in the Portland metro area. Anybody who's been in Oregon for any amount of time understands that the west side of the state and the east side of the state are different. What makes sense for the west side of the state doesn't make sense for the east side of the state. And that it doesn't make any sense for either one of those groups to be dictating policy to the others. So our organization came along. There's been this long-standing divide. In fact, it goes all the way back to when the state was first founded. When they first decided where to put the border for the state of Oregon, there were 60 delegates at the statewide convention, 1 from Eastern Oregon, 59 from Western Oregon. The one person from Eastern Oregon said, I think it'd be a good idea to put the border along the Cascade Mountain Range because Eastern Oregon is so different from Western Oregon, and it will always be the case. But much like today, the 59 delegates from Western Oregon outvoted him, decided to put the state border where it is currently, and we've been dealing with that ever since. So our organization came along and said, we've had this longstanding problem that goes all the way back 170 years. What if we update that state line? What if we move the state line between Idaho and Oregon, move it to where the actual cultural and geographic divide in the state is, which is the Cascade Mountain Range, and let the people of Eastern Oregon who identify with Idaho culturally, politically, economically, in just about every way, let them get their state government from Idaho and let the people of Western Oregon continue to get their state government from Oregon. That was our idea. We started going to votes in counties in Eastern Oregon and asking the people directly if they thought this was a good idea. And over the last 4 years, we've gone to votes in 13 counties in Eastern Oregon, and we've won in all 13 counties.
Wow.
This is a solution, a long-term solution that the people of Eastern Oregon are ready for.
And how many counties are you hoping, how many counties are there east of the Cascades that would be included in the Greater Idaho?
Yeah, so there's 17 counties east of the Cascades, okay. and we want to take 14 full counties. So the beauty of an imaginary line, of a state line or a border, is that it is an imaginary line. It can go wherever it makes sense to go. And the whole reason that we have borders and these imaginary lines, they're political tools to group similar peoples for political representation. So we can move that to wherever it makes sense. We want to take 14 full counties because Eastern Oregon is a very conservative place, voted for Donald Trump well over 70% as a whole. And 14 of those counties are very deep red, just like Idaho. It would make sense. There's 3 counties that only part of those counties we want to take because those counties kind of have some big urban centers. And really, a lot of this boils down to, even countrywide, we're having this urban culture is different than the rural culture. And that's creating, they want different things. People in these urban settings want different politics. They want different policies. They want different things for their communities than people in the rural areas. So our proposal, because it's an imaginary line, says let's take the conservative parts of 3 counties and leave the urban parts as part of Oregon. That's the way they vote. We assume that's the way they'd want to stay with Oregon instead of Idaho. So 14 full counties, 3 partial counties, but about 60+% of the land mass of the state of Oregon.
Wow. I imagine one of those partial counties includes Bend.
Yes, it sure does.
Right.
And so Mark, obviously, a little bit about Oregon politics. And,
yes.
Bend, I grew up in Bend. And when I grew, when my family moved to Bend as a youth, there was 12,000 people. It was a very conservative small town in Eastern Oregon. It's exploded in population. It's well over 100,000 people now. And as that's happened, as tends to happen all over the place, as it's gotten more urban, it's gotten more left-leaning, more progressive. And Mark, our whole movement is not about trying to be pro-Republican or pro-Democrat. Our movement is about saying, hey, it doesn't make sense. The people in Bend are very left-leaning and want very left-leaning government and policy. That's fine. That's okay. That's not what I want out in my community out here in Crook County, but it's okay if they want that. But what doesn't make sense is don't have Bend forcing policy onto my community, which is the exact opposite, which votes 75% for conservative policy. If we let people get government that they actually want and they're actually voting for, we can lower the political tension. We can take the polarization that's already there, but there doesn't have to be tension just because there's polarization. The tension comes from when one group's forcing their policies, their values, their way of life on the others. So let's use all the political tools that we have to get people government that they actually want, the vast majority of the people in their community want, and lower that political tension.
Yeah, I mean, you talked a lot about the urban-rural divide in this country, and I think a lot of folks on both sides may not understand. I mean, it's a different lifestyle, really. In a city, you're literally living on top of each other. In a rural area, the government may do nothing than maintain county roads. There's no local police. It could be a sheriff that could be an hour away to respond. Many students are homeschooled. It definitely requires a much more self-reliant sort of individualistic lifestyle. And, if you live in a city, it almost is a collectivist approach in some respects because people literally live on top of each other. And in the city, you can't blast your radio at 3 a.m. to full blast, but you can do that in a rural county as you should be able to. I mean, do you think a lot of it has to do with that just difference in lifestyle, different approaches to being?
Absolutely. And Mark, most Americans get that. They understand that. They understand that policy for Portland, Oregon doesn't make any sense for policy for Burns, Oregon, because these are completely different places. You mentioned, sheriffs and the police presence. One of the things that happened out here in Oregon is we had a statewide measure 114, and it was a gun control measure. So if you go to the west side of the state, people want gun control. They want they want restrictions on the Second Amendment. They aren't comfortable with guns in their communities, and so they want to restrict those things in various ways. That's fine. I understand, and the people out here in Eastern, I think most people understand why somebody living in a very urban setting would not be comfortable with guns all over the place. But you get out here in Eastern Oregon, and it's a very, very different culture. It's a very, very different existence. People here, everybody here has guns. It's part of day-to-day life. People hunt.
Right.
People have firearms for fun, for recreation, for self-defense. And we have counties in Eastern Oregon that are bigger than states in the United States.
It's amazing.
And those counties may only have 6,000 people that live there. So right. You're exactly right. There might be one sheriff on duty at any given time. And that sheriff might be an hour and a half away. If there's a problem at your house, you are the self-defense, right. And so and that's just one small example. You can get into to all sorts of topics, but people know and people understand that what makes sense for our cities are really densely populated cities. That doesn't make sense for our rural areas. So why are we trying to force policy across the board on either of those groups? And one of the things here in Oregon, a couple of years ago, we had a governor's race, and people think of Oregon, they think it's this deep blue state, and it has become that way over time. But really what Oregon is it's a deep blue metro area, and then kind of the rest of the state is pretty conservative. Right. But we had a fairly close election for governor a couple of years ago, and Oregon's had a Democratic governor for 40 years. But the Republicans out here thought this was our chance. Everybody was upset about COVID and all these things. We had a very most unpopular governor in the country. So they thought, we'll have a chance to get a Republican governor, and then we'll have our people in charge. But what we said all along is, even if that were to happen, if you were to get a conservative in charge, or a conservative legislature in charge of Oregon, you would only have the same problem in reverse, because the policies that the conservatives that people out here in Eastern Oregon are voting for, if they tried to implement those policies on Portland, it wouldn't work. You would have massive tension. You'd have massive, upheaval, because the people in Portland want very different things than the people of Eastern Oregon. That's okay. So let's figure out how to disentangle these two groups instead of forcing the Portland metro area and incredibly rural southeastern Oregon or northeastern Oregon, right. Instead of forcing them into a tug of war where they have to decide who gets to make policy for the other, why don't we disentangle them and let them both get government that makes sense for their communities?
And you're talking about southeastern Oregon, and just for scale for folks back east, one of my favorite stories is the Crane Union School District is one of the largest school districts in the country. It's the size of Massachusetts. It is a public school. It's a public high school that's also a boarding school, because it covers such an area that's so vast. These kids can't commute to school every day. Yeah. They've got to live on the high school, and it's just amazing to think about in the lower 48 that there are that vast stretches of area.
And there are, again, it doesn't make any sense then for somebody that's sitting in, Multnomah County, Oregon, to be saying, well, I think that I know the way that would be best for those people out there to live. It's a completely different culture. It's a completely different everything. And so if that person in Multnomah County is trying to dictate policy, which they do through statewide government, try to force policy onto our rural communities, you get backlash, you get frustration, you get people that are just, at their wits' end, because it doesn't make any sense and it shouldn't be.
So we talked about the rural-urban divide, and that's across the country. I mean, even the cities in Texas are voting largely blue. There's Chicago versus the rest of Illinois. So this isn't unique to the state of Oregon, but why Oregon? Why secede in the state of Oregon? Why the push here as opposed to other places?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think that one of the answers to that, so you're right. There's movements like ours that are cropping up all over the place. Like there's one in Illinois that's trying to separate from Chicago because they have the same problem. We hear from people in Eastern Washington every day. They say, how do we get, how do we join your movement? How do we do something similar? Because they have the same problem. You have King County in Seattle that the population dictates policy to the entire east half of the state. East half of the state is completely different than the west half, very conservative. So this is a problem all over. Why does it make sense in Oregon? Part of the reason why it makes sense here is because Eastern Oregon and Idaho are so similar. Most people in Eastern Oregon, a lot of the people in Eastern Oregon already do more business in Idaho than they do in Western Oregon, because Oregon is so large. Boise is closer to a lot of Eastern Oregonians than Portland is, or Salem. So we already have the same geography, the same economy, the same, political culture and just, social culture. So Eastern Oregon and Idaho probably always should have been, if there was no lines on the map today, they would be grouped together. You wouldn't group Eastern Oregon with Western Oregon. You'd group them with Idaho because we look the same, we act the same, we want the same things for our communities. So it makes a lot of sense. And then, secondly, I think our organization, and I wasn't involved at the time, but a lot of these sorts of ideas have come up because people are looking for solutions. What people really want is they want peaceful political solutions that solve problems, create wins for people. That's what your average person is looking for. When our organization started, we made the decision right away to go ask voters directly. And I think that was why our movement has gotten more traction, has gotten further down the road of making this happen than other movements, is because we said, hey, we've got this great idea that we think is great, but it really doesn't matter what we think. What really matters is what do the people who live there think? And so we've gone to the people who live here and asked them, and what those people are saying is, yes, we want this to happen. That gives us a huge amount of capital to then make change because we've already asked voters and we already know what they want.
And so what are the places in the other parts that have yet to vote or have some voted and have declined to join the Greater Idaho movement? Where are you on these ballot measures?
Yeah, so we're hoping to move 17 full or partial counties. 13 of those counties have already voted and passed our measures, saying either A, they just, is either a straight up question of we want to be part of Idaho, or B, we want our elected leaders to pursue making us part of Idaho. To look into it. So we've had 2 counties that we still have yet to vote at all in Eastern Oregon. And that's for a variety of reasons that I won't go into the details, but you can get, in order to get a question in front of voters in Oregon, we have a citizen-led petition, initiative. And there's certain things that have to happen to make that happen. So it just hasn't happened yet in those 2 counties. Our original plan, our original map was to include Southern Oregon because Southern Oregon is also very conservative. If you look at the Southern Oregon counties, you get to Douglas County. You get south of Eugene and it's all very conservative. We went to votes in Southern Oregon 3 times, twice in Douglas County, once in Josephine County. And we lost, while we've gone 13 for 13 out here in Eastern Oregon, we lost all 3 votes in Southern Oregon. And what that told us was, the people in Southern Oregon, even though they vote conservatively, they don't identify with Idaho the way that people in Eastern Oregon do.
Right.
And they're not comfortable. They don't want to be part of Idaho. And that's okay. Our movement has never been about trying to grab as many counties as we can. Our movement's always been about what do the people in the places that live there want and how do we get them what they're actually asking for? So we changed our proposal. We let go of the Southern Oregon counties and we just focused on the Eastern Oregon counties. But we know at this point, after having 13 counties vote and we win and we have a healthy winning percentage. It's not like, we're not winning these by 1 or 2%. We know the people of Eastern Oregon want to pursue this. And we know that the people in Idaho, so the Idaho legislature in 2023 passed a memorial inviting the Oregon legislature to begin border talks. So polling shows that this is a very popular idea in Idaho, which makes sense. There's a ton to gain for Idaho and Idahoans, more land, more resources, conservative, like-minded voters that vote just the same way that they do. So there's a ton of upside for the state of Idaho. So we have a lot of support from people in Idaho. We have support legislatively in Idaho. The governor has come out and said he supports border talks, but we haven't had it. We know we have the support of Eastern Oregon. We know that we have the support of Idaho. We haven't gotten any kind of traction with the Oregon legislature. And that's where we're at now. So our movement is, in order to change a state line, any state line can be changed between 2 states. All it requires is that the 2 states agree to move it. So, which makes sense. If Idaho and Oregon are having a problem and they need to adjust their border, then the 2 state legislatures can come together and say, you know what, we could solve this problem if we move the border over here. And if both states agree, U.S. Congress signs off on it. It's a process called the Interstate Compact process. That's how you can move a line. Many lines have changed. State lines have changed throughout the history of the United States. Full counties have moved from one state to another. Full states have been carved off of other states. It's a political tool that was used frequently in the first 150 years of our country's existence. It has not been used frequently in the last 100, which makes some people think, oh, this is crazy. This could not happen.
It's sacred. It's set in stone.
Yeah, exactly. But it could happen, and it should happen, and it's a tool that we could be using. So the process is 2 states both have to agree, and the U.S. Congress. We know Idaho is a willing partner. We know the people of Eastern Oregon want this to happen, but the state legislature in Oregon is refusing to take this up.
And so let's talk about population. Idaho's a little over 1.5 million. And what is the population of the eastern part of Oregon? I mean, can it absorb, you said the land is 63% of the state of Oregon. It's a lot of land. Can it absorb all those people, maintaining, those rural roads and communities?
Yeah, so a couple pieces to that. So Idaho's about 1.6, 1.7 million people. Eastern Oregon, we're looking to move about 400,000 people into the state of Idaho. So one of the reasons, you asked earlier, why Eastern Oregon? Why does it make sense? Well, part of the reason it makes sense is because Eastern Oregon can join Idaho and not overwhelm them, politically, voter-wise, electorally. A state is going to be really shy about inviting in more people than already live there, because then all of a sudden you've lost control of your own state. But with Eastern Oregon, we'd only be adding about 20% of the population to Idaho. So, and we vote actually more conservatively than Idaho, but still, one of the reasons why it doesn't make a lot of sense to add Eastern Washington is Eastern Washington has a much bigger population. They could, if you added Eastern Washington to Idaho, then all of a sudden it doubles Idaho's population.
Wow.
And that's not as desirable for, if I'm a person that's living in Idaho and I like the direction of my state, well, adding, 400,000 conservative voters, that seems like
you can absorb that amount.
You can absorb that. I don't want to absorb 2 million, more than already live here. So it's about 400,000 people. There was an economic analysis that was done in 2023 by an independent group in Moscow, Idaho, and they looked at what would happen if Idaho accepted these Eastern Oregon counties. So if you took these counties, you brought them into Idaho, what happens tax-wise, what happens economically? And what that study showed is, because Eastern Oregon and Idaho are so similar, and the per capita earnings of Eastern Oregonians are almost exactly the same as Idahoans, Idaho could absorb Eastern Oregon, and it wouldn't be a financial drain on them. In fact, it would be a plus to their tax base. So it would be an economic benefit to the state of Idaho to add these Eastern Oregon counties. And even better is that Eastern Oregon counties, this economic analysis said, if the Eastern Oregon counties could get out from Oregon's heavy regulatory environment and into Idaho's less regulatory environment, that the economies of Eastern Oregon would take off, and you would see, growth above and beyond what you would expect if these counties stayed in Oregon. So again, it would be a financial win for Idaho. It would be a financial win for the people of Eastern Oregon. And it actually would be a financial win for the people of Western Oregon, because right now, Western Oregon subsidizes Eastern Oregon. Even though Eastern Oregon is very similar economically to Idaho, it's not similar to Western Oregon. Western Oregon is quite a bit wealthier than Eastern Oregon. So right now, tax dollars flow from Western Oregon into Eastern Oregon. If they let us go be part of Idaho, they keep all those tax dollars at home. They spend them on, the needs and concerns that the people of Western Oregon have, without having to ship them off to Eastern Oregon.
So why has the Oregon legislature been so opposed to it?
That's a great question. Mark, I think you'd have to have one of the legislators on to answer. We're presenting our proposal is a win. It's a win for Western Oregon financially, like I just talked about. It's a win for Western Oregon electorally and politically. Right now, the Oregon legislature has a supermajority, but if you followed Oregon politics at all, you know that what's happened in Oregon is, even though the Republicans are a minority, there's enough Republicans that they can deny quorum to the Democrats if they decide to walk out. And so that's what we've seen. Republicans don't have a lot of power in this state, but one of the powers they have is just say, we're not going to show up, and then nothing happens. So you get this gridlock, even though it's a Democrat supermajority state, you get this gridlock that just shuts down state government at times. And that's because you have all these Eastern Oregon representatives and senators that are deeply conservative, and they can't tolerate the policy that Portland wants, that Salem wants, that Eugene wants, that they're trying to force through. So if you let us go, you don't have all these Eastern Oregon legislators that are blocking the policy that Western Oregon wants for to make their communities better. So it's a win for Western Oregon financially. It's a win politically. They can get the kind of policy that makes sense. We have had a bill that was introduced in the Oregon Senate asking the state of Oregon to invite, to take up Idaho on border talks. And the state Senate said, we're not even going to have this conversation. We're not going to give it a hearing. We don't want to hear it. We've consistently heard from Oregon politicians, the governor and the Senate president and the House Speaker, that they want Oregon to remain whole and represent all the people that live in Oregon. I think there's a certain, a sense of loss that would come from people in Western Oregon if they felt like Eastern Oregon was no longer part of their state. Oregonians take a lot of pride in the kind of the idea about the state is so diverse geographically, and like you got the coast and you got the mountains and you got the desert and you got all this, anything you want you can find in the state of Oregon, and that's one of the things that people are real attached to. So I think that has something to do with it, and part of it is just frankly, people that have power over other people and they don't have to give it up.
They like to maintain that.
They like to maintain that. And so part of part of what we're trying to do is say, hey, this is not okay. The people out here have voted and said, we want to peacefully separate. And most Americans, the vast majority of Americans believe that when somebody wants to just peacefully disassociate from another group, that you should let them, and that it's wrong to hold people captive against their will. And so part of, our what we have to do is we have to get this message out. We have to let the rest of America know, hey, we got a situation out here in the United States where you have a group of people who are asking for nothing but just to peacefully separate and join a different state. And they're voting and saying this is what they want to do. And their own state legislature is holding them captive against their wishes. And that's wrong, and that needs to change. And we need to, put some pressure on the Oregon legislature to, at least sit down and have the conversation with us.
Do you think this has become, particularly acute in the state of Oregon because not only is it a blue state, but the western part of the state is so deeply blue that, for me, and I've read other people online say, hey, everybody has one vote. People voted, they voted differently than you did, and now you're saying we don't want a part of it just because we didn't like the way that the vote went. But I am thinking in terms of, having lived in Oregon and western part of the state, understanding, particularly in the last 5 years, and, the defunding the police movement was particularly keen in Portland area, the decriminalizing of hard drugs. Do you feel like, and of course that was a failed experiment, but do you feel like it was so extreme compared to what people in Eastern Oregon thinks that it was a unique place in America that is different than, let's say, Dallas versus the rest of Texas or Houston?
Absolutely. That part of the reason that you're seeing it happen here is because the policies that are being pushed forward by the west half of the state are intolerable to the people on the east side of the state. This is not just talking about minimum wage or tax rates. Those are the sorts of things that people on the left and the right have disagreed on forever. How much government services, those sorts of things people disagree about, but those aren't the sorts of things that make people say, hey, I can't live like this. I can't live under this, this system. But what we're seeing coming out of the west side of the state and coming out of Portland and Salem is exactly those sorts of things that people say, I can't live like this. I can't tolerate living like this. And it really, started, COVID was what really, we started, our movement started in 2019, and then COVID happened in 2020. And it just lit a fire under people on the east side of the state, because like in lots of other places, our urban centers on the west side of the state, they were all okay with lockdowns and closing down schools and closing down businesses and churches and forcing masks on people and vaccines. The east side of the state was completely opposite. People here didn't want their schools closed. They didn't want their churches closed. They didn't want their businesses closed. They didn't want to be forced to wear face masks. They didn't want to be forced to take vaccines or lose their job. And that was such an extreme and harmful thing that happened in our state. And it was coming from the west side of the state, this draconian policy forced on the east side of our state, that it turned a lot of people in Eastern Oregon, including myself, who had never been involved in politics. I had my own political views. I paid attention, I voted, but I'd never gotten involved in politics. But after going through COVID, and I came to the determination that I cannot continue to live in a place that the government can destroy my life, can ruin my kids' education, can kick me and my family out of church forcibly. I can't do that. I can't tolerate that moving forward. So I'm going to try to change it, and see if we can get this border changed so that the next time, a pandemic or some other emergency comes along, my government it has the same values as I do and wants the same things as what I do and the people in my community want. So I think COVID was a huge, that was because COVID was so drastic and so impactful, and it did. Yeah. I mean, it in Oregon, we had kids out of school for like a year and a half. We were one of the longest lockdown states in the country. And that was all coming from Western Oregon. That was all statewide policy that was forced on us. And the people in Eastern Oregon, didn't want that. They wanted the policy. We wanted the policy of Idaho, which was kids were back in school, businesses were back open, people were going to church, after a couple months, life back to normal. Masks weren't forced on people. Masks were optional. And that's the policy we wanted. But we couldn't get it because people that lived hundreds of miles away from us with very different values were forcing different policy on us. So COVID is a perfect example. Measure 110, I'm glad you brought that up because Measure 110 was the a big city solution to a big city problem that got forced on the entire state. Even though the east half of the state, all of the greater Idaho counties voted overwhelmingly against Measure 110. They said,
what was Measure 110?
Measure 110 was the drug decriminalization. So the people in the east half of the state said, this sounds like terrible policy. We don't want this. It went to a statewide vote. All of our greater Idaho counties voted against it, but the west side of the state said, we want to try this. We want to do this. The west side of the state has 90% of the population. They passed it, becomes statewide policy. It was a total disaster. Such a disaster that the legislature had to go back and fix it and kind of repeal that, even though it only been in place for 2 years. But that's an example also. That's extreme policy that the people in Eastern Oregon said, we did everything we could to say, no, don't do this. We don't want this in our communities. This is a bad idea. But it was policy that was rammed through and forced on us anyways. And that's the kind of stuff that causes just this massive political tension and frustration. And it propels movements like ours to say, you know what, if we can never outvote them and we're completely at the mercy of what people that live hundreds of miles away with very different values of us want to do in our communities, then we need to find a different solution, and we need to figure out how we can get different statewide government.
So let's talk some nuts and bolts. I mean, in terms of time zones, there's a 6% state sales tax in Idaho. What do people think about that? I mean, like the mechanics of actually moving a state. How would that work? It hasn't been done in 50-something years.
True. It hasn't been done, state to state on a massive corporate level, but it is done every day by people. Change states every day. And that says thousands of people move from one state to another. They adapt to the new rules of the new state. They get their new driver's license. They get their new certification in whatever their, profession is. Right. This isn't, are there going to be issues that have to be resolved? Absolutely. And some of those issues are exactly why this needs to happen. So for instance, take legalized marijuana. Oregon has legalized marijuana. And so we have a marijuana industry in Eastern Oregon. When legalized marijuana first came up, every county in Eastern Oregon voted against it. They said, we don't want this. This doesn't match our values. We don't want this in our community. But it got passed by the west half of the state, got forced into our communities. So now that it's legal, now you've had these businesses crop up, right? So now every town's got a cannabis store and people are growing marijuana out here. So now we got this problem. So we have all these people that's like, well, what's going to happen to cannabis? Because Idaho, it's still illegal in Idaho. And And yeah, that's going to be a tough one to unwind. And that's going to have to be decided. What is going to happen? Are we just going to go straight into Idaho law and it's just going to be illegal to grow marijuana, and all these people that have invested in businesses and everything else, what happens with them? I'm not sure. And the process is for the two states to come together and figure out what that looks like. And so for those sorts of sticky issues, the two states will have delegations that come together and say, here's where we want to move the border. Here's the laws that will change. Here's how we're going to grandfather things in or not grandfather things in. And then they will have that in a contract that lays all that out. And then what we have advocated for, again, because we're a movement about self-determination, we're just a grassroots group of people that think this is a good idea and want to help other people that think this is a good idea make this happen. So once we have all those nuts and bolts in place, once we know what laws are going to change and what that's going to look like, we would advocate that goes back to a vote of the people. And if people still agree to it, then it happens. But for most things, it's not going to be as complex as people think. The state of Oregon owns very little land in Eastern Oregon. So Eastern Oregon is about 50% federally owned and about 49% privately owned and about 1% owned by the state of Oregon. So people get this idea that Oregon owns Eastern Oregon. Oregon doesn't own Eastern Oregon. Oregon governs Eastern Oregon. The people of Eastern Oregon own Eastern Oregon land, and the federal government owns Eastern Oregon land. All of that can switch into Idaho governance without much of an issue at all.
Interesting. So you're saying much of it is Bureau of Land Management, BLM?
Yep, absolutely. Yep, National Forest, BLM, and that's federally owned, so it would just switch into Idaho governance. And so again, we're talking about 9% of the population. Those 9% of the people that we're talking about moving, they've been paying taxes in Oregon. So we support the idea that negotiations would begin at Eastern Oregon takes 9% of Oregon's debt obligations with them and 9% of Oregon's assets with them. Start negotiations there. That's what seems fair and makes sense since we're talking about 9% of the population, and go from there.
There was a funny comment. It was the top comment on the CBS Sunday Morning clip, and it said, "I support making Idaho wider on the condition it is renamed Widaho." What do you think about that?
That was the number one comment. To people, I will say this, people love the idea. I think that most people, if they thought that this could happen, we'd have this cropping up all over the place. I mean, you'd have counties in Wyoming and or Colorado that would join Wyoming. You'd have counties in Eastern Washington. The number one thing that has held back these movements is that most people just don't think it's possible. But it absolutely is possible. And there is a process and there is a precedence. And it's just a matter of getting the political will to make it happen. And our group, our organization, we've gotten right to, we're a long ways down this road. We know Idaho's ready to have this conversation. We know that people of Eastern Oregon want to have this conversation. If we can get past the Oregon legislature stonewalling us, we can get this border moved. It will happen, and it will make people's lives better. And I think it will instantly, kind of open people's eyes to this idea that there are these other political tools that we can use. We live in a very polarized country, and you can, if you have polarization, you can either try to convince people to agree with you, which is great, or you can force people to live your way or get their way forced on you. Or you can say, okay, how can we live side by side as neighbors without forcing our values on you? Let you live your life the way you want to, that makes sense for your community. Let us live ours. And we think our solution is the best path forward, not only for Oregon, but across the country.
And so you mentioned, I guess it would have to be ratified in Congress. And my understanding is that it's somewhat of a rubber stamp if both states agree. Is there a fear that, as you said, that this could become a true movement across the United States, that folks in Congress may be concerned that this could snowball and really change the map of the United States into something that looks dramatically different?
Yes, I think that is a concern, but again, you asked earlier in the interview, like, why Eastern Oregon? And part of why Eastern Oregon is Eastern Oregon makes sense. Eastern Oregon, you can move these 400,000 people And it's not even one electoral vote. It doesn't even, Eastern Oregon already has one state or federal representative who's a Republican.
Right.
That one electoral vote maybe would move into Idaho. It would depend on what happens with redistricting in 2030. But the national impact of Eastern Oregon moving is incredibly small. It's less than 0.2% impact federally. Could I foresee where the people in Congress would be nervous about if you were trying to take 2 million people from Eastern Washington and the national implications of that? For sure. But our movement, our proposal really has very little impact other than it makes the lives of 400,000 people considerably better, and the state they're joining and the state they're leaving, the 3.6 million people left in the state they're leaving. So we think Congress would approve our proposal. If Oregon and Idaho can come together and say, hey, we want to move the border, it'll make everybody's lives better. We don't think Congress will have a problem with that.
So what are the next steps? Where do you go from here?
The next steps is we have to get the Oregon legislature to engage in the process. And so that's where we're stuck right now. We've spent 4 years asking voters what they want. We know what voters want. We were in the Idaho legislature in 2023. We know that Idaho is on board. Our next steps is we have to get the Oregon legislature engaged. So we will have legislation introduced in Oregon on the House side and the Senate side. We have an open invitation out to the governor to meet with us anytime, any place. We'll travel to Salem and to meet with her and talk about this. But we've got to get the Oregon legislature to actually respond to their own citizens asking to leave. And we've reached out to the Trump administration to get involved because we've been getting stonewalled by our own government. So we're asking for outside help. We need the rest of America to say, hey, it's not okay what's going on out there. It's not okay to hold people who only want to peacefully separate, to hold them captive against their will. That's not the way we operate in the United States, and that's not okay. And we need that pressure from the federal government. We need that pressure from the rest of the country to get Oregon to come to the table.
Have you seen at least a sort of conciliatory atmosphere amongst the Western state representatives saying, wow, we've got a problem on our hand and clearly the people have spoken and we're not paying attention to the folks in Eastern Oregon. We got to do something. Has that atmosphere changed at all? Or are you noticing that? Is it a win-win in some respects that?
Well, it certainly has raised the profile of the people of Eastern Oregon. It's hard to ignore us when we keep, passing measures saying we want to leave. That has been a positive. It has highlighted, when we had a governor's race 2 years ago, every single, candidate was asked, what are you going to do about Greater Idaho? What about these Eastern Oregon counties? And so It has brought attention, which has been a positive. But Mark, we've been hearing in Eastern Oregon, every time somebody runs for office and wins statewide office, they say, I want to be a governor or a secretary of state or attorney general for the whole state, and I want to listen to everybody. Course, and that's pretty typical. What really counts is what actually happens when the legislature is convened. And in that sense, we haven't seen any kind of conciliation towards Eastern Oregon. When we redistricted a few years ago, there was a bargain with Eastern Oregon, conservatives to come to the table, and we'll give you a fair representation, equal representation on this committee. That was instantly broken as soon as they got back into session, and so we haven't seen any kind of actual policy outreach to Eastern Oregon in a meaningful way.
Wow. What would be your recommendation to people listening to this show in other parts of the country that are considering a similar kind of movement?
Yeah. So one thing I would say is support free people that are voting to, take their own future into their hands and do what you can to support our movement. And if that's financially, that's awesome. If that's even just posting, social media or writing legislators or writing your own legislator and say, have you seen what's going on out there? We need help. We are stuck out here, and we are saying we've done what we can to say that we would like to change our state governance, but we can't. We don't have the power to do it unless the people that are holding us back agree to let us go. So we need the help of the rest of the country to say that's not okay. Most Americans don't think that's okay, and you need to let these people go. So that's one thing. In their own states, I would say, look at what do the people in your state want? Be willing to look at other solutions. Moving the border is not the only solution. Some people want to create states. There's things like autonomous regions that have been talked about in other states, but look to the people in your own community. What political tools can we use? What solutions can we offer that will lower tension? We know we're polarized. So what sorts of things can we do to lower tension, allow communities to have government that makes sense for them, whether that's more localization, whether that's creating autonomous regions, whether that's moving state lines, and then talk to your legislators, and more importantly, get things in front of voters. Find out what people actually want, because that's, in the United States of America, that's who's supposed to drive everything. Is what do the people want? And that's what we've done out here. We know what the people out here want. So that's where I'd say to start.
Great. And how can people find out more about the Greater Idaho movement?
Yeah, they can go to greateridaho.org and check out. We've got lots of information, an interactive map that you can see, all the counties that are moving and how they voted and why we think, a long detailed list as to why this is a good idea.
Excellent. Well, Matt, it's been a pleasure. Any final thoughts? Anything we didn't cover?
I don't think so, Mark. I really appreciate the opportunity. Again, we're looking for peaceful political solutions like most people. When you ask most people, what do you want out of your government? They want win-win solutions. They want to live their lives. Most people aren't political beasts. They don't want to spend all day, worrying about Democrats and Republicans. They want to live their lives, and they want government that works for them. We need more solutions like ours. And so I appreciate the opportunity to come on and tell your listeners about us.
All right. Well, thanks for being on the show, Matt. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark.